Frank Sullivan didn't expect a $50 fine to sting more than a bullet graze. But there it was, in his inbox, courtesy of the Serene Oaks Homeowners Association. His crime, installing a single, low-wattage blue light on his garage, the kind that drew less power than a toothbrush charger. For Frank, it wasn't decoration, it was survival. A retired Air Force colonel who had landed cargo planes on jungle strips and earthquake zones, he wasn't afraid of darkness. He just hated what it reminded him of. That little light gave him peace. But in a community where mailbox color had to be HOA approved, peace required permission. The blue beacon became a battlefield, and Frank found himself once again fighting. This time not for his country, but for the right to sleep through the night. What followed wasn't just a bureaucratic standoff. It was a quiet rebellion, a clash between military precision and suburban rigidity. And when a once-in-a-decade storm struck, the true purpose of Frank's light would be revealed to everyone. Colonel Frank Sully Sullivan, USAF, retired, was a man forged in routine. For 30 years, his life had been a series of checklists: pre-flight, in-flight, post-flight. Checklists saved lives. They brought order to chaos. Now, in the quiet expanse of retirement in the Serene Oaks community, he had a new set of checklists. Lock the front door. Check. Lock the back slider. Check. Arm the security system. Check. But no matter how many boxes he ticked, one variable remained stubbornly unchecked: the sprawling, uncertain darkness that pressed against his windows each night. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a dislocation, a sense of being untethered. Eleanor had been his anchor, his true north. Without her, the nights felt vast and navigable, only with a map he'd lost. He'd sit in his den, the faint scent of her rose-scented lotion still clinging to a decorative pillow, and feel a familiar restlessness creep in. It was the same feeling he'd get on a long-haul flight over a black ocean, the kind of deep-seated unease that only the first glimmer of dawn on the horizon could cure. He had flown C-130 Hercules cargo planes, big, beautiful workhorses he lovingly called flying trucks. He hadn't flown sleek fighters. He'd flown missions of mercy. He'd landed on makeshift dirt strips in Central America after earthquakes and brought tons of food to famine-stricken villages in Africa. His most vivid memories were of descending through thick cloud cover toward some disaster zone, searching for the faint, flickering lights of a temporary runway, a string of hope in a sea of devastation. Finding that runway, that glowing path home, was a feeling of profound relief, a sacred connection. That was the feeling he was chasing. One Tuesday afternoon, an idea took root. It started with a memory of landing at a forward operating base in the Balkans, guided in by a single, steady blue light at the threshold of the runway. The light didn't blast away the darkness. It gave it a focal point. It gave you a place to aim. An hour of searching online led him to a specialty aviation lighting supplier. He didn't want a floodlight or some garish decorative piece. He wanted something specific, authentic. He found it: a single, low-wattage, vapor-sealed LED threshold light, the kind that could withstand a 100-mile-per-hour wind and sipping only a few watts of power. It was perfect. When the small, heavy box arrived, he felt a spark of the old purpose. On a calm, sunny Saturday, he got out his ladder. He was meticulous. He measured the center of the eave above his garage, drilled a clean pilot hole, and fed the wire through a weatherproof gasket sealing it with silicone. He ran the low-voltage wire neatly along the inside of the garage rafters to an outlet, securing it every 12 inches with a cable staple. The job was clean, professional, military spec. That evening, as dusk bled across the sky in strokes of orange and purple, he plugged it in. A single, pure blue light bloomed against the beige stucco of his house. It wasn't bright, it wasn't intrusive, it was just there, a quiet, cerulean star. Frank stood at his bedroom window, looking out at it. The knot in his chest loosened. The vast, menacing darkness now had a reference point. He felt the phantom weight of a flight yoke in his hands, heard the phantom crackle of a headset. "Got the threshold in sight," he whispered to the empty room, "bringing her home." For the first time in months, he slept through the night. The peace lasted for a week. The email arrived on a Monday morning. The subject line was sterile. Official notice of bylaw violation, 412 Serene Oak Lane. It was from Brenda Maxwell, president of the Serene Oaks Homeowners Association. Frank read the message, his coffee growing cold in his hand. "Dear Mr. Sullivan, this serves as a formal notice that your property at 412 Serene Oak Lane is in violation of the Serene Oaks covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The violation pertains to the installation of an unapproved exterior lighting fixture. Specifically, this is in breach of Article 7, Section C. All exterior modifications, including but not limited to lighting, painting, and structural additions, must be submitted to and approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Furthermore, exterior lighting must not create light pollution or detract from the uniform aesthetic of the community. Please remedy this violation by removing the unapproved fixture within 10 days of this notice. Failure to comply will result in an initial fine of $50, with further penalties to follow for continued non-compliance. Sincerely, Brenda Maxwell, President, Serene Oaks HOA. Frank read it twice. Light pollution? The bulb used less energy than a refrigerator magnet light. Uniform aesthetic? It was a blue dot the size of a silver dollar, barely visible from the street. He felt a familiar weariness wash over him. This was exactly the kind of trivial, ground-level conflict he'd spent his life trying to rise above. His first instinct was simple. Take it down. It wasn't worth the fight. It was a silly, sentimental thing, and life was too short for battles over light bulbs. He finished his coffee, the taste now bitter. He went about his day, tidying the garage, paying some bills online, trying to push the email from his mind. But as evening approached, he felt the old anxiety begin to stir. The thought of facing the unbroken darkness again felt like a defeat. He was standing in his driveway at twilight, staring up at the small blue light, when a voice startled him. "You know, I rather like that." It was Carol, his neighbor from across the street. She was a retired nurse in her early 70s, with a kind face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She held a pair of gardening shears. "It's a peaceful kind of light," she continued, walking closer. "Not like those harsh floodlights some people have. It reminds me of Christmas, just a little bit." Frank managed a small smile. "Something like that. It's a thing from an old job." Carol nodded, her gaze soft with understanding. "My husband, Bill, he was in Vietnam, a medic. For years after he got back, he had to sleep with the closet light on. Drove me crazy at first. Then I realized it was the one thing that let him close his eyes. Some things you carry with you." She paused, glancing from the light back to Frank's face. "You stick to your guns, Frank. Some things are more important than neighborhood rules." Her words landed with surprising force. "Some things you carry with you." She understood. She didn't need to know about C-130s or makeshift runways. She just knew. That night, as Frank stood at his window, the blue light felt different. It was no longer just a comfort for himself, but a small act of defiance, a quiet declaration that not everything that makes a person whole can be written into a book of community bylaws. He thought of Eleanor, and he thought of Bill, the medic who needed a light in the closet. He decided the light was staying, at least for one more night. The 10-day grace period passed with the slow, deliberate pace of a military parade. Each evening, Frank's blue light switched on, a silent sentinel in the encroaching dusk. And each evening, Frank felt a small, quiet victory. He had drawn a line, not in anger, but in quiet necessity. Carol would give him a supportive wave from her porch, a simple gesture that felt like a powerful alliance. He was no longer just a solitary man defending a quirk. He was a neighbor with a friend. On the 11th day, the letter arrived. It was heavier than a normal envelope, the paper thick and important feeling. It wasn't an email this time. It was a formal declaration of war, HOA style. The fine, as promised, was $50, with a stark warning that the penalty would double if the violation was not remedied within another 15 days. The language was cold, impersonal, and absolute. Frank was in his driveway examining the crisp, professionally printed letter when Brenda Maxwell's golf cart whirred to a stop at his curb. She was wearing a pink visor and a determined frown. "Frank," she said, her voice leaving no room for pleasantries. "I see you got the notice." "I did, Brenda," he replied, his tone even. He folded the letter and tucked it into his back pocket. "And?" she pressed, gesturing with a dismissive wave toward the light on his eave, which was currently dormant in the bright afternoon sun. "Are you going to do the right thing and take that thing down?" Frank met her gaze. He saw no malice in her eyes, but a frustrating, unbending certainty. She was a person who believed with every fiber of her being that the world worked best when everyone colored inside the lines. The problem was, she couldn't see that some people needed different lines. "I don't believe I'm doing the wrong thing," he said calmly. "It's a low-wattage light. It's for personal reasons. It's not bothering anyone." Brenda scoffed, a short, sharp sound. "It's bothering the bylaws, Frank. It's bothering the architectural standards that we all agreed to when we bought our homes here. Do you know what happens if I let this slide? Next thing you know, Dave Miller at the end of the cul-de-sac will put up his flashing football helmet light again, and Mrs. Gable will decide to paint her door lime green. There has to be order." "This isn't a football helmet, Brenda. It's a single, small, stationary light." "It's an unapproved modification," she shot back, her voice rising slightly. "That's the beginning and the end of it. Pay the fine, take it down, and we can all go back to being good neighbors." She didn't wait for a response, putting the golf cart into gear and gliding away, leaving a wake of righteous silence behind her. Frank stood in his driveway, the sun warm on his face, feeling profoundly misunderstood. Good neighbors, Did being a good neighbor mean erasing any part of yourself that didn't fit the mold? That evening, he saw Carol tending to her rose bushes. He walked across the street. "Round two?" she asked knowingly. Frank nodded. "She called it that thing." Carol sighed, snipping a withered bloom from a bush. "Brenda's not a bad person, but she ran a dental office for 40 years. In her world, if an appointment is at 10:30, it's not at 10:31. And if a crown is shade B2, it's not B3. She doesn't have a category for things that are different but still okay." She straightened up, looking him in the eye. "But that's her problem, not yours. You know, the bylaws are a public record. They have to keep a copy in the community clubhouse library." A switch flipped in Frank's mind. He was a man who planned missions. He studied reconnaissance photos, weather patterns, and enemy capabilities. He never went into a situation without knowing the terrain. Brenda had quoted Article 7 at him. What else was in there? The next morning, he walked to the Serene Oaks clubhouse. The library was a small, stuffy room with shelves of donated paperbacks and a single table. On a bottom shelf, he found it. A thick white 3-ring binder with Serene Oaks HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions printed on the spine. He hefted it onto the table. It was over 200 pages long. He started at page 1. He read about lawn maintenance, trash can placement, and the approved palette of exterior paint colors. It was a masterclass in mandated mediocrity. He skimmed past sections on pets and parking. Then he found it, tucked away in a section about property upkeep, long after the lighting rules Brenda had quoted. Article 12, Section A, General Safety and Maintenance. Residents are permitted to install discrete, low-impact, energy-efficient lighting fixtures for the express purpose of ensuring personal and property safety. Such fixtures, including motion sensor lights or pathway markers, do not require pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee, provided they do not constitute a nuisance to adjacent properties. Frank's heart beat a little faster. It was a loophole, a crack in Brenda's fortress of rules. His light wasn't just a sentimental object. It was a beacon for his own peace of mind. It was, in a very real sense, a safety light. It kept the shadows of his past at bay. It was discreet, low impact, and energy efficient. It fit the description perfectly. He took out his phone and snapped a clear picture of the page. He walked out of the clubhouse not with the swagger of a warrior, but with the quiet confidence of a pilot who had just found a safe alternate landing strip on his map. The next HOA monthly meeting was in 1 week. He would be there, and he would be prepared. The community clubhouse meeting room smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade carpet cleaner. Frank sat in one of the uncomfortable stackable chairs, about 20 other residents scattered around him. At the front, Brenda Maxwell sat center stage at a long folding table, flanked by a treasurer who looked nervous and a secretary who was already typing furiously. The meeting droned on with the usual business: a treasurer's report on the budget for lawn fertilizer, a debate about whether to allow pickleball on the tennis courts. Frank listened patiently, his hands resting calmly in his lap. He felt a familiar sensation, the long, boring stretch of a mission before the critical 10 minutes of action. Finally, Brenda announced, "New business. We have the ongoing compliance issue at 412 Serene Oak Lane." All eyes turned to Frank. He felt a flush of heat on his neck, but kept his composure. "Frank, have you complied with the notice?" Brenda asked, her tone suggesting the answer was a foregone conclusion. Frank stood up. "Brenda, members of the board, I haven't taken the light down because after reviewing the bylaws, I don't believe it's a violation." A murmur went through the room. Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Explain?" "As you noted," Frank began, his voice steady, "Article 7 requires approval for aesthetic modifications. However, Article 12, Section A, makes an explicit exception for safety lighting." He held up his phone, showing the picture he'd taken. "It allows for discrete, low-impact, energy-efficient lighting fixtures for the express purpose of ensuring personal safety. My light meets every one of those criteria. It's an LED that uses less than 5 watts, it's no bigger than a doorknob, and its purpose is entirely for my personal sense of well-being and security. It is, by definition, a personal safety light." He had expected a discussion, a debate. He had expected rules to be matched against other rules. He had not expected mockery. Brenda let out a small, incredulous laugh. She looked around the room, sharing her amusement. "Personal safety? Frank, with all due respect to your service, we live in a gated community. What possible threat are you protecting yourself from? Wayward owls? Bad memories?" A few people tittered nervously. The man who wanted the football helmet light, Dave Miller, chuckled loudly. "Yeah, Frank, if you can have a memory light, I want my team colors back." The logic of his argument dissolved in the acid of their ridicule. He was no longer a neighbor making a reasonable point. He was a strange old man with a weird fixation. "This isn't about memories," Frank said, his voice tighter now. "It's about feeling secure in my own home. The board does not find that feeling secure constitutes a legitimate safety exception for an unapproved aesthetic modification," Brenda declared, her voice ringing with the finality of a gavel. "The violation stands. The floor is open for a vote to uphold the fine." Hands shot up around the room, Brenda's allies eager to enforce the status quo. The vote was overwhelmingly against him. Frank sat down, the blood pounding in his ears. He had never felt so dismissed, so utterly invisible. The battle was over. He had lost. He sat through the rest of the meeting in a daze and left as soon as it was adjourned, avoiding eye contact. He felt a fool. Carol had been kind, but maybe Brenda and the others were right. Maybe he was just an old man clinging to strange things, making a nuisance of himself. "Colonel Sullivan?" The voice was quiet. He turned to see the young man who lived a few houses down. The one Carol had mentioned was an engineer, David Chen. "I just wanted to say, your point about the bylaw was solid," David said. "Article 12 clearly contradicts Article 7. From an engineering standpoint, calling that little LED light pollution is a joke. They just didn't want to listen." "Doesn't matter now," Frank said grimly. "Maybe not," David said with a shrug, "but it was a good argument." The small validation felt like a lifeline. As David walked away, Carol appeared at Frank's side. "Don't you let them get to you," she said fiercely. "They laughed because they didn't understand. That's their failing, not yours." Something inside Frank shifted. He had faced down colonels, generals, and congressmen in his career. He had flown through thunderstorms that would make Brenda Maxwell's hair stand on end. He was not going to be defeated by a committee of busybodies. He had lost the public argument, but the mission wasn't over. It was time for a new strategy. The next day, Frank Sullivan did two things. First, he wrote a check for $100, the original $50 fine, now doubled, and mailed it to the HOA. He included no note. Second, he drove to the hardware store. He walked past the paint chips and the lawn ornaments and went straight to the emergency preparedness aisle. He bought a large, deep-cycle marine battery, an inverter to convert its DC power to AC, 2 high-lumen LED lanterns, and a dozen long-life batteries. As he was unloading the gear into his garage, David Chen happened to walk by, walking his dog. "Stocking up for the apocalypse?" David asked with a friendly smile. Frank looked at the battery, then at the sky. The weather report had mentioned a tropical storm brewing in the Gulf, but it was supposed to stay well offshore. "Just an old habit," Frank said, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Always have a backup plan. You never know when you might lose power." The storm did not stay offshore. It turned. In the space of 12 hours, it swelled from a disorganized tropical depression into a furious, tightly wound hurricane that meteorologists on TV were calling anomalous and dangerously unpredictable. Serene Oaks, which prided itself on its tranquility, was directly in its path. By late afternoon, the sky was a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind began to howl, a low moan that grew into a high-pitched shriek. Palm trees bent at impossible angles. Frank methodically went through his old storm prep checklist. He brought in his patio furniture, checked the seals on his windows, and filled his bathtub with water. He made a thermos of hot coffee, and he watched his little blue light, a tiny pinprick of defiance against the churning gray sky. The power began to flicker around 7 p.m. Each time it did, a collective groan went up from the houses on the street. At 7:32 p.m., a brilliant blue-green flash lit up the neighborhood, followed by a deafening crack boom as a massive oak tree, the one that gave the community its name, surrendered to the wind and fell across the main power lines. And then there was darkness. Not the gentle, familiar darkness of night, but a profound, disorienting blackness. It was absolute. The only sound was the roar of the wind and the percussive drumming of rain against the roof. All the small, comforting hums of modern life, the refrigerator, the air conditioner, the digital clocks, were gone. The silence he'd felt after Eleanor's passing was a library compared to this void. In her house across the street, Carol jumped as a flying pine cone hit her window like a gunshot. She felt her way through the darkness, her heart hammering. Her husband Bill had passed 5 years ago. She was alone. The darkness felt suffocating, and the sound of the wind was like a living thing trying to claw its way in. Panic began to prickle at the edges of her mind. Where was the flashlight? She stumbled towards the kitchen, her hands outstretched, and her eyes searched the blackness for any point of reference. And then she saw it. Through her front window, past the thrashing trees, was a small, steady, unwavering dot of blue. Frank's light. It wasn't illuminating anything, not really, but it was there. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos. Her panic subsided, replaced by a wave of gratitude so intense it almost brought her to tears. She could see which way was out. She could see where help was. 2 houses down, Brenda Maxwell was furious. A leak had sprung in her sunroom, and she couldn't see where the water was coming from. Her phone had no signal. She felt a tremor of real fear. She was the president, the one with the rules and the order, but she was utterly powerless. She peered out her window, and the first thing she saw was the faint blue glow from the Sullivan house. The irony was so bitter, it tasted like metal. The one light in the entire development, the one single point of order in the chaos, was the very thing she had declared a symbol of disorder. In his own home, Frank was calm. The blackout was an expected contingency. He switched on one of the LED lanterns he'd bought, its clean white light flooding his living room. He checked his phone. No service, as expected. He turned on a small battery-powered weather radio and listened to the grim reports. He was running through another checklist in his mind. Check on neighbors, establish communication, assess damage when safe. A frantic banging on his front door cut through the roar of the storm. He opened it to find Carol, soaked and shaken, her face pale in the lantern light. "Frank, the power's out everywhere. I saw your light," she stammered. Come in," he said, his voice the epitome of calm. "I've got coffee." He had just settled her in an armchair when another set of figures appeared on his porch, drawn like moths to the only flame in town. It was the Millers from the end of the street. "Frank, is that you?" Dave Miller shouted over the wind. "Our CO2 detector is beeping, the battery-powered one. My wife is terrified there's a gas leak or something." "It's probably just the power surge," Frank said calmly. "But let's not take chances. Come on in. It's safer here." He looked out from his open doorway. Through the sheets of rain, he could see other shadows moving, other neighbors emerging from their dark homes, uncertain and afraid. They were all looking in his direction. They were all navigating by his little blue light. His home and the defiant beacon on its eave had just become the unplanned, unofficial command post for the entire neighborhood. The mission had begun. Frank Sullivan, a man who had felt adrift in the quiet of his own home, was suddenly back in the command seat. The chaos outside didn't rattle him. It focused him. His living room, illuminated by the steady glow of 2 LED lanterns, transformed from a lonely space into a bustling operations center. "Okay, listen up," Frank said, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter of the half-dozen neighbors now huddled inside. It wasn't a shout, but it had the effortless authority of a man used to being heard over the roar of engines. "We need to know who needs help. David," he said, spotting the young engineer near the door, "you know about electrical systems. I don't want anyone touching their fuse boxes, but can you and Dave Miller do a quick, safe visual check on the houses nearby? See if anyone's got damage to their main conduit. Take a lantern and be careful." David nodded, his face serious. He was no longer a curious neighbor. He was part of the team. "Carol," Frank continued, turning to her, "you were a nurse. The Gables at the end of the cul-de-sac are in their 80s, and Mr. Gable is on oxygen. We need to check on them. Make sure his backup tank is working. Can you go? Take someone with you." A younger woman, who had been huddled in the corner, immediately stood up. "I'll go with her." Slowly, methodically, Frank turned panic into purpose. His home was the rally point. His emergency supplies were the community's resources. His quiet, steady leadership was the antidote to the fear that the storm had unleashed. An hour later, a new figure appeared at the door, rain-soaked and humbled. It was Brenda Maxwell. The leak in her sunroom had worsened, and she had finally abandoned her dark, dripping house. She stood on his welcome mat, dripping water onto the floor, the pink visor gone, her face pale and stripped of its usual certainty. She had navigated through the debris-strewn darkness using the one landmark she could see, the blue light she had fought so hard to extinguish. "Frank," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The Gables." Carol got there just in time. His oxygen concentrator had failed when the power went out, and his backup tank was low. "They're here. They're safe." Frank just nodded. "Good. Grab a towel. There's coffee on the counter." There was no "I told you so" in his eyes. There was no victory. There was only the calm focus of the mission at hand. And in that moment, Brenda saw him not as a rule breaker, but as a leader. She saw the value of a man who prepared for the worst, while others were busy polishing the best. The storm raged for another 4 hours. By dawn, it had passed, leaving behind a world that was broken and bruised. Trees were down everywhere. The beautiful, orderly landscape of Serene Oaks was a disaster zone, but the community was intact. Thanks to the impromptu network coordinated from Frank's house, the most vulnerable had been checked on and no one had been hurt. The little blue light, still glowing faithfully, had been their North Star. 2 weeks after the storm, Serene Oaks was still clearing debris, but something had shifted. The once quiet cul-de-sac now buzzed with shared purpose. Neighbors who barely waved before were swapping tools and stories. And at the center of it all was Frank Sullivan, the man whose blue light had guided them home. At the emergency HOA meeting, Frank arrived in uniform, pressed slacks, polished shoes, and his Air Force lapel pin gleaming under the fluorescence. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Brenda Maxwell, shaken by her own night of helplessness, attempted an apology. But before she could finish, David Chen stood up with a printed stack of HOA bylaws. "Article 12 was always clear," he said. "The violation was never his. The mistake was yours." The room applauded. A motion was passed not only to rescind the fine, but to censure Brenda for procedural overreach and remove her from the HOA presidency. A new vote was held, and by unanimous decision, Frank was named honorary advisor to the Community Safety Committee. That night, the residents of Serene Oaks gathered on Frank's lawn for an impromptu barbecue. Someone brought folding chairs. Someone else brought a flag. Carol brought her potato salad. Kids played with flashlights. Neighbors shared storm stories, and the blue light glowed steadily above it all. Frank stood quietly by his porch, sipping iced tea. The knot in his chest was gone. Not just because he'd won, but because, in the fight for one small light, he'd brought his neighborhood out of the dark.